Good afternoon. Welcome to this NHRDN webinar on the theme, Our Profession, a Paradigm Shift from a Career to a Calling. Today we'll get perspectives on this theme and more from our panelists, 4 of whom have been featured in the book, Being People by Dr. Joseph George. The book, Being People, covers the HR practice in India through the compelling stories, anecdotes, and wisdom of 6 HR leaders spanning the last 60-odd years. It covers key aspects in their lives, early influencers, their upbringing, their role models, their professional learning, formal and experiential, their networks. It covers their crucible experiences, their shadows, confessions of things left undone, their habits or discipline that made for their personal impact, the conception of the HR profession, values for practice, and glimpses into the future of it. As a reader and an HR professional currently in the thick of practice myself, this was a very deliberate read for me. I took my time to savor and synthesize the experiences shared. Their stories are powerful reminders of why I choose to serve in this noble profession every day. My name is Dsouza, and I will be your moderator for this session. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, let me familiarize you with the session and the objective of it, and the sequence of events to follow. If you move to slide 2, you will see the session objective and the schedule. We'd like the NHRDN members to be introduced to these exemplary professionals and to extend their stories to you so that you have an interactive session with us. The flow of the session will follow with the introduction. We will then move into insight sharing. During this time, the 5 panelists will share their experiences featured in the book. We will then move into the discussion of the theme itself. And finally, we will open the floor to questions from our participants. And then we will move into the wrapping up space. A few guidelines before we get into this for our participants, just to ensure that we're able to take in as many questions and have as seamless a process as possible. We move to slide 3. All questions will be taken only on the chat window. You may send in your questions at any time during the session. We will be moderating these in the background, so we're able to deal with them more efficiently towards the end. Please ask as many questions as you please. If possible, we'd like you to state your name, the location you're from, and your organization so that we're able to address your answer directly. If your question is addressed to a specific panelist, please state that as well. With that, I will move in to introduce our esteemed panelists, and I'd like to start with Mrs. Lakshmi Acharya. She's the spouse of the late Ranjan Acharya, in whose tribute this book has been written. He features as the evergreen synesthete in the book. Mr. Acharya was the Senior VP Development at Wipro at the time of his passing in 2009. Mrs. Acharya is a consulting clinical psychologist and an executive coach with Wipro. We have with us Mr. Aroon Joshi, who's logged in from Pune. He is featured as the HR's modest connoisseur. He's worked with organizations like Burma Shell, Metalbox, Cadbury, and RPG. Mr. Joshi is an executive coach and a consultant. He is also a founding member and on the board of ISABS. Mr. George Kunnath, described as the radical humanist in the book. He's worked with the Xavier Institute, Bombay Dyeing, Mahindra & Mahindra, and MRF. He's presently a leadership consultant, learning coach, and breathwork facilitator. We have with us Mr. Vivek Patwardhan, exemplifying the caress of justice in the book. He started his career with Crompton Greaves and then moved on to Asian Paints, where he worked for over 34 years. He's an independent director on various boards, a blogger, and a blog writer on industrial relations. Dr. Bandyopadhyay, described as the resilient sage. He started his career with the NDDB, the National Dairy Development Board, moved through Ashok Leyland IT, Saskin Technologies, Cambridge Solutions, Del Perot Systems, Citrix Solutions, and is now the founder of HR Plus, an HR consulting firm engaged with many large Indian and multinational companies, as well as startups. Dr. Pallab is also a teacher of mergers and acquisitions and related HR at XLRI. And last but not the least, Dr. Joseph George, the author of the book, Being People. Dr. George has had the privilege of working with Ranjan Acharya as part of the corporate HR team at Wipro. He has several accreditations and certifications to his name. Some of them are MBTI, Belbin, PAPI, Harrison Assessment. This list goes on. He has an OD certification from the National Training Laboratory and holds a PhD in social sciences in the evolution of OD from TISS Mumbai. He is currently the partner at Workplace Catalyst LLP, a leadership and OD facilitator, a coach, and human assessment specialist. We have a heavyweight team on this panel. And with that, let's jump right into the insight sharing for today. I will direct the questions to the panelists and please clue in seriously into the answers they have for us. Let's start with you, Mrs. Acharya.
Sure.
I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the book. This is Mr. Azim Premji's reflections on Mr. Ranjan Acharya. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Ranjan was an exemplary human being. To me personally, Ranjan was someone who willingly and every time put Wipro's interests ahead of his own. This needs a certain maturity and character which is not easy to find. Ranjan's work and personality made a much wider impact, way beyond Wipro. There is much to learn from Ranjan's life and work for the HR fraternity. Would you give us a glimpse into how you believe Mr. Acharya was able to integrate his personal purpose into his profession?
Sure. You know, a couple of things about Ranjan was a people's person, not the cliched kind of people's person, but he genuinely connected with people at a much deeper level. And his values and Wipro's values were kind of, it synced so well that, Wipro's values and Ranjan's personality was one kind of, it was part of Ranjan's personality. So I think that is where the, they gelled so well. And he was very passionate about what he did, and any role that connected with people, he was very passionate about. And just to give you an example of how he put the organization's priorities first, Ranjan went into coma on the 12th of July 2009, and on 11th, he called his team in the hospital to do their appraisals. It was appraisal season, it was July. So he called them and he did it. And he did it like, with his usual jokes and his usual humor and all that. And so that is who he was. And he used to always ask the doctor, will I be just able to go back into the classroom and do my trainings? Because he was very passionate about training and facilitating also. So, yeah, so, and then, he also, when he connected with people in a room, if there were people of different levels, different wavelengths, he could connect with each person like he's connecting with them personally. So he had that capability of connecting with people at a deep level. And yeah, so I hope that answered your question.
It did, ma'am.
Yeah.
It's interesting how when I did meet you at the book release in Bangalore as well, you did bring up that one of the core values that we have to have in this profession is literally the simplest of it, which is titling the title of the book, which is literally being people. And
Yes.
it seems like Mr. Acharya personified that to its very core.
Yeah. Yeah, whether it's within the organization or outside the organization, you'll hear the same thing from everybody. Whoever knows Ranjan will know him to be that person who connects with them at their level. That is who he was.
So very true. Thank you for that insight, ma'am. We'll move on to our next panelist, Mr. Joshi.
Yes, ma'am.
The timing of when you joined Cadbury in 1971 was not at all an enviable time for most of us HR professionals. The organization was still coming out of a strike. There was a lockout for close to 7 months. Production had stalled. People were unhappy. Management was in dire straits. It was a difficult space all around, complete stalemate. With your astuteness, you were able to turn around a hopeless situation with a positive impact for both the organization and the people who worked there. In most of our books, this would be a mission accomplished, success all around there. But you didn't stop at that. You went on to do a root cause analysis of why there was a problem to begin with, the actual problem underlying the organization, the rift and misunderstanding between the rank and file. And then you went on to do interventions to address that misunderstanding, to bridge that gap, going above and beyond really. Would you be able to tell us what drove you to choose that path, to go above and beyond, to go beyond just what looked like success?
Yeah. Well, I started off working in HR on the premise that a worker joins an organization not to join a union or not to go on strike, but to come to work and earn his pay. Now, for workers to go from earning their earning their wages to becoming violent is a huge journey. And it struck me that it's not something that is normal for a person unless he is goaded into doing that. And to me, that was an important thought. And if a person is goaded to that extent, then there must be something which requires investigation on the side of what is goading him. And that's the only thing that goaded him, goad the worker, is the management that makes him work. And therefore, I needed to look at what it is that makes him go to this extent. And that's how I came to the conclusion that I came, that it is not just one-sided, it is two-sided. And because it is two-sided, the answer lies on both sides. And since the management is the elder, they have to do the first step. And unless they do the first step, the difference that has come about in terms of trust as between them can never be reconciled. So therefore, the first and the second and the third step has to be management, who will then have to be resilient enough to be able to say, okay, if this didn't work, let's try something else. Fortunately for us, things began to fall into place and it worked. And because it worked, we were able to get to where we ended up when I left, in a very happy, very, very prosperous situation. So basically, the way I look at it is, we need to look at what goads people to do what they do. And if we are able to honestly find the reasons, then to get to a solution is not too difficult. It just means that we have to drop a few things, change a few things, and begin to look at life differently than the way we are used to. That's really the way I looked at it. So if you look at the Cadbury situation at that time, I think we were very strong masters, treating everybody else as servants. And the life around us had changed, that servants were no longer being servants, they were being educated and were slightly different, and therefore required a slightly different way of treatment. If you look at Maslow's needs, and I did look at them, they had moved from basic needs to being much more social and ego-related. And when they get to that stage, to treat them as laborers and servants just does not work. And to me, that was a starting point for making things change. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it absolutely does. I do love the management is the elder. It stayed with me. It's something we should use in this time where very often we feel that management in the organization is more powerful, which it is, but to continue to believe and hold on to the truth that we are the elder and we must behave as such is something.
Great.
Thank you so much, Mr. Joshi.
Pleasure.
Mr. George Kunnath, this one's for you.
Yes.
I'm picking up from something you said in the book around innovation. And I'm paraphrasing it. You said a lot of the time, senior management and HR get stuck imitating and blindly following the founder or the leader in an organization, especially in organizations where the founder or the founding members are still leading the organization. We do this blind imitating and following at the cost of innovation and growth of the organization itself. Often convincing ourselves that we're serving a greater purpose, we're following the founder's direction and vision. And we safeguard this with our life, quite often not knowing why. Very often the things we safeguard aren't even relevant in the context we're playing in. It takes a lot of courage to call it out to the founder as well as to the managing team that it's time to change. In a time where startups are becoming a norm and where founders or founding teams are a force to reckon with, what can you offer us in the HR profession to empower us to be able to, so to speak, tell the emperor about his new clothes? To challenge the management if it is time for change?
I like that analogy of emperor as having a new clothes. So I would say seeing the emperor is naked is very easy, but getting him to see he is naked is a challenge.
Absolutely.
And the way to approach, at least my way of approaching that is, it's where am I coming from? Is it my need that the emperor sees he is naked? Or is it the need of the organization and the founder? And when I come to that, I would say it's all about mindsets. We are all being products of our conditioning, which means we are stuck in our paradigms. And when we need to look at us leaders and followers, the difference is leaders are constantly aware of the mindsets in which their conditioning the mindsets. They are ready to leave their conditioning behind and move from paradigm to the next one all the time. So this is where innovation comes in. If I'm stuck in my conditioning and mindset, innovation is not possible because I'm only supporting what is there. Maybe I am so impoverished to look at another option rather than safeguarding what is there. So unless I'm ready to break that, there is no way I can go. And in all this, authenticity comes first with self and others. Even at the cost of my job, I should be able to put across that, yes, emperor has no clothes. You need to look at that. So it's not for me. I'm very clear about it. So I put the self-interest at the back burner and put up what is the interest of the organization. That's where I am.
Very interesting, sir. Saying one should be willing to fall on their sword in the larger interest of the organization. I'm not sure how many of us have the courage to do that, but it is a calling. One of the other things you mentioned in the book was the HR team is as strong as its CEO.
Yes.
In that context, to be able to win the confidence of the CEO or the management of the firm, to believe that the HR team has their best interest and the organization's interest at heart, and therefore will make those hard calls, just like you did. Stand up and to call it out when you see things that need to change. To speak from authenticity. Do you have a point of view on that?
Yes. I would say if I see that very clearly and if I don't say I'm not honest with that, then I'm not doing my job. Look, even if it takes a lot of courage, yes, it takes a lot of courage. And, if the CEO doesn't want to listen to you, maybe you call it a failure at that point of time because that's not what is happening. Am I ready to do that also? That, okay, I didn't succeed in convincing the CEO for that. But a message is given. Here is someone who is willing to look differently, think differently. I think that's what we need to do. If we say yes to everything, then where is the change possible? Change can happen only when there is a disruption. When we challenge the status quo, then only change can happen.
Very true. Very true. The course of a river will change only if there is resistance. It's interesting. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Patwardhan, this one's for you.
Yeah.
This is 1975 Asian Paints. The time when the organization decided to cut its losses by retrenching people. You did something unheard of. You followed protocol and published a seniority list, which is a requirement of the law at the time. And then you went on to write up an article in the employee newsletter, one that stated that an amendment was passed and retrenchment would not be possible. Those are two contradicting but very bold actions.
Hello. Sorry, I lost you in between.
I shall start with that, Shastra. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
All right, let me start from the beginning.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Asian Paints in 1975, the year of the emergency. when the organization took a call to cut its losses by retrenching people.
Yeah.
And you did something quite interesting at that time. You went out and followed the protocol of the organization and published the seniority list, which is the order in which people would be retrenched. And then you went on to write an article in Marathi so that everyone understood it in the employee newsletter, clearly stating that there's an amendment passed which would make retrenchment impossible. These are contradicting actions and very bold ones, I must say. What you did was you provided your employees a comprehensive view of their options. You respected their ability to discern, and you provided them with the knowledge they needed to be able to choose their course of action.
Yeah.
In a time now where layoffs have become a norm, and most corporations and management decisions don't always prioritize the employees' interests, where the people entrusted with the very responsibility to protect and serve these employees' interests feel subservient and often helpless to the management decision. What advice or words of courage could you offer?
Let me go back a little bit. In 1975, because of oil prices suddenly shooting up, the entire economy was tumbling down with an inflation rate of nearly 35%, and all companies were finding it difficult to do a business. When we published a seniority list, that is to say, the intention to retrench people, and around that time, I published this article because Chapter 5B, as it is known, made it compulsory for people to seek permission. Now, this might look unusual, but remember that my boss, who was the director, was a lawyer, and he believed in informing people everything. He believed that a well-informed worker is the best worker because he takes a well-informed decision. So, my publishing article was not seen as a punishable offense within the company, though some people were shocked. But since the boss was not against it, I had some cover, I would say. And the catch was really in the response of workers. So when I told workers that, it's not possible for the company to retrench people easily, and in fact, it is practically impossible. They told me that if management wants to retrench people, will get it done no matter what. Now, this was the ground reality of their perception. They knew how these fights went. So that was a big learning for me. So the fundamental principle of all HR activities which I learned and which is there in every book is that hear the other party. And it becomes increasingly important to listen to the other party at every step. So what I learned is that balancing of people interest and business interest is extremely tricky and extremely difficult. Books can talk about it, but practicing it is a great skill, I would say. But being open about how you reached a certain decision and what decision is finally made is not difficult to actually take it to people. And being open is very important. Being communicative is very important. My understanding is that our society, we as a society, are not very communicative. You will see this at airport or railway station. Too little information is given even to passengers. Forget about companies. So we are not communicative, and to add to the misery, our organizations are extremely hierarchical. So that complicates the fact. Now, you coming to your question as to why things are different these days. In good old days, there was a union which opposed the thing, and even the government was largely pro-labor. Today, the situation has changed, and there is effectively no opposition. And because there is no effective opposition, actually the real values of leaders and the real values of organizations are coming to the fore through their action. People may not protest, but people are watching. And this is one reason we have to be doubly cautious of acting with fairness when there is no opposition. And I think that's the lesson to be learned here. So you are asking me, why do people, leaders miss out that they neglect their character building or conviction? Okay. I suppose all of us are work in progress people. Okay. We require a good culture and we require some innate fire to act conscientiously and to act fairly. I believe there is a merit to say that the leader should actually set the way, but there is equally merit in saying that we should influence the leader. I mean, it is both ways, and to put everything on the head of the leader is also not fair. So I feel two things to sum up. I think we must at all times hear the other party, and when there is no option, that causes that makes us behave with extra responsibility, with all our values and good practices and good governance practices. I think that's what I would like to say.
It's extremely insightful, sir. I've just moved between a few organizations where I personally have had to execute a few layoffs as such, and they were never easy. And I do appreciate that it is important to listen to.
If I may take a minute, Earl, you know,
Yes.
I have recently blogged about Racord and Kalyani Weld. Racord closed down on the annual of Diwali, and suddenly people were left high and dry. It's there on my blog, so I'm not telling something. Similarly, Kalyani Techno Weld, okay, closed down on 31st of December without much notice to people. One day people came there and found that they were kicked out of the organization. Now this is where problem is. Okay, I think there is no talk, there is no explanation, there is no openness, and which is so vital if you want to manage people respectfully.
That is so very true. That is so very true.
Yeah.
There is my sense of the little experience I have in being the person who carries this news to the employees that need to be let go of, or the employees who will be impacted by a serious restructure. My sense of the management and the team that makes these decisions is we're always operating in fear. And the fear of what will the backlash be, what will people think, maybe we'll outsmart them if we don't tell them, they won't know. And that takes me back to your experience with Mr. Chari, where you never underestimate the power of your employees and their ability to sense and perceive what is happening in the organization.
That's right. And added to that is the fact that we essentially act out of fear and see the other party as an adversarial party. Whereas other people understand if your company is not doing well, they know what is in store for them. Nothing comes as a surprise to people. But, you know, can we be open? Can we talk openly? Can we act more out of hope rather than fear to solve the issues together? That's the issue.
Very true. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Bandyopadhyay, this one's for you. And it's picking up from the same line of the conversation we've just had with Mr. Patwardhan. This is concerning congruity of values, where you masterfully executed it at Saskin Technologies during the telecom downturn. You employed the most basic of human values there, the power of honest dialogue. What you said you all did is not use fancy PowerPoint presentations, none of that. You all had heart-to-heart conversations, and you facilitated over 80 such meetings across that period of time to try and make this work. That must have been some experience. Would you tell us more about it and what stands out for you in that experience?
Thank you, Paul. You know, this has been a very major experience in my life, which actually reinforced my values that human being, as everybody is talking, even now, Vivek said, we are all in the making. We need a good culture. And I set the context with that. Human being, they're always ready to achieve something if I use a higher purpose. I mean, that was a sort of a turning point in my life where my values got reinforced. So this was the situation, as late 90s, the telecom industry has lost close to about $3 trillion. Those days, it was a lot of money all around. And we were a company, unlike many other software company, Sasken was the first product company in India. So I think there were a couple of facilitating factors, I must say, that in our leadership team, we have people who have just came back from US. Those days, that was not in vogue. But being a first product company, both our founders came back from US. And the senior management team even had a lot of academics from IIT Bombay who came, and again, as I said, the organization was built on a purpose of creating something called Indian dream, and Indian dream of creating a world-class product company. So this is in context, and I remember we used to go to all the top campuses, IITs, and those days it was called RECs, which later on became NIITs, and Indian Institute of Science to recruit. Even when we recruited people, the best of the people from electronics and computer science, we used to reiterate that this is to build an Indian product company, and one. Second, in spite of the fact that when the market tumbled down, we remained as a telecom software company. We decided to remain as a telecom software company. So the context is here you have a bright group of individuals, young people who have come to the organization because they wanted to be a part of a dream. Now, having said that, and this was the time we used to talk about our HR practices. Even in 90s, we didn't have any attendance system. In 90s, we used to have a policy of human resource policy where everybody traveled economy, everybody was given the same allowance. And I remember many of my colleagues used to say and tell us that you pay the same salary to everybody. So we used to jokingly say that, no, we pay differential salary, but all things, and we used to sit all on the open. And remember, it is 97. And so this was the culture we built, and no attendance system. And if you complete 4 years, 5 years of your service, you will get 4 weeks of paid sabbatical. So we were in some sense pioneer in terms of putting those policies and processes. So therefore, when this question came, we just calculated. I remember we realized that we had to lay off from so close to about 200 people, 1,000 people organization. And the biggest worry we had, like that if we let these people go, they will be picked up by Motorola and Texas Instruments, who are very much, in some sense, always knew the Sasken people are best in class and they will recruit. And if people start leaving, then how do you stop attrition? And then coming back to values, as you said, we said we are a people organization. That's what we always used to say. And we said that, then we debated. And I must tell you, we had a very bright young HR team, close to about 40 people, extremely brilliant. And we sort of started talking about, how do you deal with this 200 people and the consequences of letting go 200 people? And then the question of how we remain a people organization. And we realized values, and I guess that's a universal truth. Values get tested when things are not hunky-dory. Values get tested when there is turmoil all around. So we said we will stick to organizational values of being a people organization. And we figured out if we reduce the salary by 20%, everybody, 20%, and then we can manage. We don't have to lay off anybody. So what did we do? Then second thing, we also realized in knowledge organization, primarily you have to A, give a purpose, B, you have to identify role models, and role models in knowledge organization, unlike manufacturing organizations where hierarchy is a big thing, it's based on expertise. So primarily we identified who are the so-called people. They are respected because of their knowledge, irrespective of the hierarchy. I'm not telling the hierarchy was not important, but these people. And then we try to cover them. And what was the meeting? We'll go there and show them an Excel sheet. We'll say, this is the number. And if we reduce 20% salary, we manage. What do you do? What you want us to do? Because we are a organization, our organization value is people organization, and what you want to do. So we had, as I said, 80 such meetings, and I don't know how many numbers of corridor conversations. We went on doing that. And if you ask me in a hindsight, were 100% people convinced? Probably no. 70% people convinced? Yes. We did not. We're so naive. You'll be surprised to know after the actions were taken, there are some people who ask, how can you reduce salary? Did you consult legal? Did you consult? We didn't consult. We just went. We had a town hall meeting. And in the town hall meeting, we said, this is the decision. We have discussed this threadbare. And the majority of the people believe that ready to take a 20% cut. And we assured that as soon as we get out of this, issue, and we said everybody knew that there is a huge issue in the telecom industry. We also said we are not going to get into any other vertical just to survive. That also is a reiteration of our values to remain a telecom software company. And you'll be surprised to know when we, communicated the decision. The decision was communicated on a day when our CEO was going for an advanced management program in Harvard. And we said, and Harvard management programs are costly. And it was announced we are not going to cut, and we are not going to cut on the L&D budget of the organization, including the CEO's advanced management program. Nice. So imagine how difficult conversation it is when we are talking about. But then, as I said, this organization had a character. The organization has a manageable size. As I said, 1,000 people organization, 1,100 organization. The most important thing, as they say, the taste of the pudding is when you eat it. We did not lose, and I repeat, we did not lose a single person. We did not lose a single person in terms of who left the company because their salary was reduced. 9 months down the line, we restored those 20% for everybody. And we sort of managed the crisis by engaging people.
That is phenomenal. That is phenomenal. That is some experience to have. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Bandyopadhyay. So we've reached the end of the insight sharing from excerpts of the book. I hope those experiences were valuable to you and those stories compelling enough for those of you who have not read the book. It is a treasure trove. It has so many more stories where those came from. With that, I suggest we move into the next part of our session. Before we do that, just for a moment, my participants on this webinar request you to start sending in your questions, if any, on the web chat. We are collecting them and lining them up for the next part of this series where we will answer those questions. But presently, let's jump into the very theme of this webinar. Throughout the book, in small and great ways, each of you have brought out a very strong, deep sense of personal purpose. Each of you have brought that personal purpose and that value or conviction into your work. And in the way the writing is, and in the way you all are speaking now, there's a great sense of fulfillment in how you all did that, from doing that, from serving people. How do you see this space evolve for us as professionals, not only HR professionals, but as any professional today, where the focus from the time we enter our jobs is to build a strong, successful career? How do we get past that into weaving in purpose and conviction, as Dr. Bandyopadhyay put it, into our careers, so that our careers are not just limited to being a job or a place of work, but becomes more of a calling and therefore is more fulfilling? This is open to anybody on the panel.
Well, I thought I'll take an attempt to answer from my own way. As you rightly said, Paul, over a period of time, actually career has evolved. If you see in our time, and even in this, people I am probably little younger than all others, and I have seen the whole definition of career being evolved in a very expanded way. So career no more is, as Douglas T. Hall once said, he talked about it many years back as what he called was a protean career. And this protean word is actually derived from the word Proteus. Proteus was a Greek god, and the metaphor was the god can take the shape of an animal to a tree. And that's how he defined, protean career in early late 70s when nobody could think. He said, career is going to be not a typical hierarchical, going up kind of one organization experience. Career will be going to be, your life experiences. Career will be your learning. Career will be what you want to achieve as a purpose in your life. So in that sense, if we look from a perspective, as I often used to say, when in IT, the biggest difference of the people were, when I started my career, it was in employment, and IT probably in India brought a concept of employability. And if you see even today, the youngsters, so they have this expanded form of career. So to put it in a very simple thing, when somebody asked me what is a good career, that was your question, was I would say if I get to do what I love to do and get paid for that. Now, can I love something? And if I love something, do I have a passion? Yes, I have a passion. And if that part is not present in our job or career, will it be sustaining? That's one. Second thing is what we are trying to achieve. What is the end goal in terms of fulfillment? Even the question, as you said, successful. What is the meaning of successful? Being successful. So if we are not able to see that there is in some amount, at least I'm not telling if you get to do all that you love to do, but if it is not there, will you be able to sustain? I teach in competitive business schools. So I talk to these youngsters, especially in the HR profession. And what I see is the difference between somebody who is a very successful, please don't take only one measure in terms of what is the compensation and what are the designations. As Dave Woodridge says that HR is something which perceived by its client in terms of what it gets. So if you look at people, I see there are people who are doing extremely well where there is a sense of purpose. And if there is no sense of purpose, especially with the millennials, I don't know whether somebody would be able to sustain, especially for that matter, any career, but especially in HR, which at the end of the day is a helping profession.
Okay, very well said. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add to what Pallav is talking about. And I feel, understanding that as a leader, it's almost like your role is that of a parent, and also of being a human. And so humility and empathy are two very important qualities for a leader. And humility is not about thinking less of oneself, but thinking about the self a little less. And like John Maxwell said, and empathizing with the newcomers, or people who are reporting to you, how to empower them to grow in the organization. And human resources, especially being a very human focused helping profession, it's important to be human first and to connect with people at their level and empathize with them, all the fears that we spoke about. And like Mr. Aroon Joshi said, organization is the higher at a is like the older parent. And so the employees are like the children, and the reportees are like children. So leaders should be more like a parent, empowering the employees to do and creating an empowering environment for people to do their job well and bring out their best.
Yeah. May I add a few words?
Please go ahead, sir.
Hello.
Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah. A slightly different note, but the basic theme is same. Very early in my so-called career, I realized that industry makes many decisions based on principles and many decisions based on expediency. For the simple, I mean, just to give you an example, somebody who does a pretty good job gets promoted, but he comes from, let's say, I am Calcutta, certain batch, certain year batch, and you also have his classmate in the company. You want to retain him, so he also gets promoted. So what I realized is that not all decisions regarding my career are going to be rational decisions. And therefore, somewhere very early in my life, I realized that the decision makers are not rational. Therefore, don't trust their decisions. Therefore, focus only on yourself. That's the only thing in your hand. And therefore, I focused on building my own competency. One of the things which happened as a result, and I was greatly benefited from a session which I attended in the erstwhile ISISD, which is something similar to ISAPS that Mr. Aroon Joshi leads. It created a lot of self-awareness. I think I became more empathetic after I became more self-aware. I think self-awareness is the thing that creates empathy, and that's the path I took. That I got promoted as head of HR was somebody else's decision. I did not ask for it. Maybe I would not have got promoted, but I would not have regretted any decision of anybody else, because I know that it is not in my hand. When I was promoted as vice president of HR in Asian Paints, the chairman shook my hand and said, "So Patwardhan, now you are VP." Jokingly, I told him, "Sir, in lighter vein, let me tell you, I'm a born VP, Vivek Patwardhan, right?" So, I think the point is focus on yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, I would really like to add to what Vivek has said and what Biplav has said, which is, if you're looking at career, my career also, I never gave too much attention to what I was in an organization as much as what I can do. And really, the things that made for a change in my life were two. One is, of course, my first session in ISAB, which made a big difference to me in terms of self-awareness and understanding people. The second thing was a meeting with Mr. Ishwar Dayal, who became my mentor. And what he said was of great consequence to me, in the sense, one was looking at HR as a third-class job in those old days when there was welfare officer and things. But when he pointed out a different way of looking at HR, it really made a huge difference to me. What he said was that HR is a specialist function. It deals with people, it understands people, and it is required to be a specialist in terms of knowledge of people. And the reason why HR is required is because those who are managing the affairs of the organization need to be aware that people are making the things that they are producing or that they are giving up. And if one doesn't look at people the way they should be, then there will be a problem. So therefore, a specialist is required who is available to give advice on what is the best way of doing things whereby the people will begin to produce their best. One of the objectives that we created for ourselves in HR was that our job is to ensure that people give forth a spontaneous cooperation to the affairs of the company because they want to. And they want to because the people who manage them make them want to. So therefore, there were two aspects to this. One was making the managers into leaders so they can lead in the right direction. And secondly, to do those kind of things and to manage in such a way as would make for spontaneous cooperation by people. Now, these two gave rise to one thought in my mind, which is that in whatever I do, there must be some way of ensuring that you leave something behind which is of a long-term nature, which is the contribution of HR, which is known as an HR giveaway or HR gift to the organization, because HR knows people and we have used HR knowledge to be able to do this. When we looked at participative management in Cadbury, the whole thing was totally rejected by managers because they thought they were giving away their authority. But when we finally did work towards the participative approach, the managers came around and said, not only do we not need to give anything away, but we are now getting people who are managing the way, who are working with us in order to produce chocolate or whatever it is that will be produced. Now, to me, that contribution is something that an HR body thinking about people and helping to make decisions that make people much more cooperative and productive is something that is worth looking for. That's what made me happy about my profession. I really am happy for that. We got to a stage where the participation of people in terms of accepting the organization was such that when we had to knock off 180 people towards the end of my years in Metal Box, it was with the union that we discussed how we go about knocking off people. And the union came up with suggestions of saying who can be knocked off, how many should be knocked off. And instead of knocking 180, we were able to knock off 200 people extremely happily with total cooperation of the workers.
Wow.
Thank you.
Let me at this point, on that note, also bring in Dr. Joseph George. What's your view on the discussion we're having here?
Yeah, thanks to all our very willing contributors, I had a rather extended reflection on this webinar. One, I was able to, for a moment at least, get into the shoes of several participants whose voice is not in this. And I would think on their behalf, I'll just say a few things. Yes, many people have a little wonder as to how do these 6 profiles get into the book? So that's something that they will have a little mystery on. The other is also that what is the way in which the content has been organized in the book? So I'll broadly comment on these two, and then I'll hand it over to you, Pearl. Firstly, this is a very rare genre of a publication. And my first acknowledgement goes to our publisher in KK Books, Mr. K. Srinivas Murthy, had it not been him for having suggested that we dedicate an entire book to the makings of this profession over India's decades, and then dedicating that in memory of Ranjan, this effort would not have come to fruition. Of course, there were some modalities involved in that if we didn't get Mrs. Acharya's permission, this work would not be done, and so on and so forth. Several other things fell in place. And what we have, therefore, are 6 profiles who, when they made their impact, were not the consultants they are today. They were not academics, but they stayed inside the firm and transformed both the notion of the profession as also the institutions they gave their effort to. So that's in the making of the book. And the second aspect to which I want to speak to is that we dealt with their life histories as impacting the profession, and therefore when they take their life as more than the elongation of the tube from which they were born, if they can look into the future, then what's the profession really headed toward? So you'll find that this is a very exhaustive sharing that people have made, and only the edited version is in the book. So, useful to have them on such occasions where they can share. The life history method is more like, what were their early influences? Did they know they were going to become people managers and settle in this profession? Well, that's something they came to realize a little later into their jobs and careers. So I'd like to kind of reveal a bit of the source code of what this book contains. And in that sense, I thought it's useful for me to just mention these 2 dimensions. A, it's a span across the decades. B, it's a very exhaustive sharing of what all went into the making of this professional, and therefore 6 such people. And in parting on this particular segment, may I add that we don't have voice for one person. That's George Menezes here. And there are at least a few people who knew George Menezes very, very closely. And I would think he would be the personification of all that our people on the panel spoke of: empathy, self-awareness, and so much more. Perhaps with that, I'll just hand over the baton to any panelists who want to say some things about George, which perhaps not captured in the book, but nonetheless, it brings in the 6th profile as well. Mr. Kunnath, would you like to say something? Yeah, okay, Mr. Joshi, yes.
I knew George very well. I mean, first of all, he lived very close to me and we used to spend evenings together. But more than that, he was the brother of Francis, and Francis and I were considered brothers. So we were almost like family. George was an extremely sensitive person. Ideally, he should have been a priest, but he ended up being a HR personnel, which is just as good. He had a sense of humor, but he had a sense of feeling. And whilst he was not an highly expressive person in terms of his emotions, he was an extremely feeling person in terms of his feelings and his ability to be able to sense people and where they were. And it was extremely interesting to talk to George about people, because he read people, he understood people, he sensed people, and he was able to work a great deal with people, which was extremely satisfying to listen to.
May I just add a little tag that George Menezes oversaw 25 years at Hext without a single day lost to industrial strife. That was actually the experience of Mr. Vivek Patwardhan and Mr. Aroon Joshi in some part of their career or not. And that's why it's another lovely chapter to read. Very difficult work for me on the chapter, but I thought I'd just make mention of this. Mr. Kunnath.
I would add something more, since I happened to work with him for 2 years after he left Hext. And one of the things he always said about was respect for people. For one example to quote was, he says, I always used to say, don't bring people, we call people for interviews and keep them waiting for 3 hours and give them a lunch in the office canteen. That's not respect. So that was the way this man was about. and he also explored. He didn't stay in his field. He broke out and to join the right-wing party. And then he said, oh, I made a mistake. I came out of it. So there are various sides, and he was more known as a writer, humor writer, with his column by George in the Indian Express.
Yeah, Pearl, I think I've kind of extended my stay on your invitation.
No, that's absolutely fine. On George Menezes, when I did read the chapter on him, incidentally, both of us come from the same part of the country, and it hit a note. The bit that I'm sure George Kunnath will also agree with is his sense of service to the human, to the person, not necessarily the employee, but to the person itself, to actually state that every man is made in the image and likeness of God and must therefore be treated as such. It touched a chord, and it went straight to my heart to believe that you serve because they are made in the image and likeness of God, and to always remember that. A very profound, very, very insightful reading. So let's take 5, and let me see if we can tie this in for, while we are stating that each of us needs to bring our own personal purpose to the place of work, to make it more meaningful, to find fulfillment, to be more impactful in what we do, to be spontaneous in the way we are able to hold. Another calling for us in this profession as HR is to be able to enable our people to find their purpose, which is another part of it, which like Pallav has said in the conversations we've had, as has Mrs. Acharya, how do we give or help people today to find their purpose? How do we get them in touch with that core to make their careers more fulfilling? Because that is essentially what our roles are about helping them be the best that they can be in their journeys.
Well, I'll give my perspective. That's what I do I think as I see, almost everybody in this panel is a coach. So being a coach, they will know how, that is one of the things a good coach does. But in addition to that, as I said, in my own role, whether I work as a consultant or I work as a teacher, I see this is a very, very important thing today's context, because in today's context, people have loaded with information. In fact, they have more information. And one of the things I have noticed, and I will state my hypothesis, there is the enormous amount of social pressure in terms of building one's career. There's a huge competitiveness because India is a large country, and perhaps such competition is nowhere exist in the world. But third, what is very important, what is happening with this information explosion. Since you talked about career, I call it, there is a lifestyle associated with career. So there are a lot of people who are taking this choice of what I call it as lifestyle induced career choice. So for example, I decide to become a chef after I see a celebrity chef in television or social media, and I see what is associated with that. I want to become a software engineer because a senior from my same college puts a photograph in the social media on eve of the New Year, standing in Times Square and celebrating the New Year. So therefore, if I become a software engineer, that's what it is. If I am a startup owner, and suddenly there are enough news as that how much money you have made and therefore what you have done. Or if I have become a successful entrepreneur, I can become a very successful social entrepreneur social entrepreneur would mean certain kind of lifestyle. Please understand this has a larger impact in today's millennials. So I think therefore it becomes a very interesting, because what you get to see is only perhaps the good part of any profession. As I often call it, the career success, what you see. But what you don't see is what I call it as a career resilience. Like we have all been talking about, you, including you, you're talking about when you become an HR person in today's context, perhaps you have to be ready to be in a position to lay off people. I teach mergers and acquisition. And when I teach them, and I said in most of mergers and acquisition would lead to loss of job. So while there are a lot of things that I do as probably an L&D professional, I'm just giving an HR example to drive home my point, there is a lot more to deal with the stress coming out of this profession. How do I manage my stakeholders? Today, HR's job is hugely managing the stakeholders. And on top of that, if you are a multinational where metric structure is order of the day, you get to manage all the time the stakeholders, and that's a stressful thing. So the point I'm trying to make, therefore, is until and unless you bring the pivot of purpose, again, what do I choose? Then people will get to see only the positive side of a career. Or for that matter, what is the industrial relation? I'm a big fan of Vivek's writing. And I often tell my students to follow him, though there are very few people wants to get into a hardcore IR career today, even within the HR. But how difficult is that job? And I believe this career resilience or career identity, because it's a function of both. Career resilience is to be able to deal with what is the shortcomings of a career, what I need to do. And career identity is obviously considering all pros and cons. Do I identify myself? You can call it calling in a very high purpose. Is my career? Is my not a career? Is a calling? All this can only happen when you bring in the purpose, because otherwise, as you see, there are a lot of people who are getting into a career and leaving dissatisfied.
Okay, absolutely. We have our first question from one of our participants for anybody on the panel. This is a question from Puneet from Bureau Veritas, which is French MNC. His question is, HR is playing a supporting process. Is it a helper or a developer? And how does it play out in the professional space? Do we work as helpers or do we work as developers?
I'll take that. My view is it needs to be looked at from is a helper or a developer. That's what I understand. So it's what is the way I function as an HR professional? Generally, I have observed there are two kinds of functioning. One, mostly control and command and control is the mode HR professionals I have seen operating, with some exceptions. In that mode, there is no development. If I am managing things, I am not developing. So my view is that if there is a development need to happen, there need to be freedom and let go of controls. Allow people to make mistakes.
Right.
I have a thought on this, which is to add to what George has been saying. I think it's neither a developer nor a what is the other thing? HR person is a specialist. He's a specialist because he knows people, he has studied people, he has studied the body of knowledge that is available about people, and because he is, in that sense, an expert about people, he is what is required at any given moment in time in that organization. He's a helper, he's a teacher, he's a manager, he's a developer, he's a variety of things. Because he's a specialist, understands people, has studied about people, and therefore is available to be able to do any of those things as required, not just one or the other, and also both.
I would just add, piggyback on what Aroon said. I think this word has to be very, need to be contextualized very well. We are an expert profession. As I often see, HR to me is a person who is able to understand, observe, understand, and interpret human behavior. And we sit on what I call it as the organization and people, intersection of organization and people. And therefore, we use our specialized knowledge, or in other words, and therefore this both, not as a semantics, but they can use. So if you have a special knowledge, you add to help to develop individual, you help a leadership, develop leadership vision, help in developing, aligning the HR processes with the strategic needs of the organization. I can go on, but primarily, again, the intersection of people and the organization with expertise on understanding, observing, and interpreting human behavior.
Excellent.
Pearl, may I add, although I'm just the author, there's a possible thing in the question. I think it was Mr. Puneeth. Was that the name?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, Mr. Puneeth, you can always refer back relevant theory. And I'm just offering a plausible hypothesis for your question. It comes from role segmentation. That is to say, if I see the boundary of my role only within the helper identity, my crossing over and integrating the developer identity will be always in question. Similarly, if I'm in the developer identity, I can't integrate the helper identity if I come at it as a role segmented view. The perspective that both Dr. Pallab and Mr. Aroon Joshi gave was to do with integration. So there's something known as role integration too. So this is where the specialism for the people profession comes alive. And I was just adding that do refer to more and more theory. You would be able to get answer to that question too. That's the small point I had to make. Sorry.
I have a question for Mr. Aroon Joshi. This is from a participant, Deepthi. The question is inviting your inputs on how to break the culture of master-servant relationship, especially in a promoter-driven startup.
What was the last sentence? Master-servant relationship, especially
in a promoter-driven startup.
Emotion-driven pattern.
Promoter-driven startup. These startups that are driven by the founder. Yeah.
Okay. To start with, master and servant is inherent in the whole relationship that starts off in an organization, because the boss gives the subordinate a job. So therefore, I am boss, you're subordinate. It becomes a way of behavior. Now, the boss becomes master when he finds that he has to give orders and the subordinate has to obey. And that is how masters work with servants. But the fact of the matter is that masters are not really masters. They're people who have some money because of which others want to work with them for that money. And once that understanding is brought to bear in terms of this relationship, then things begin to change. For example, if the master becomes overbearing, the servant can refuse to work. If the servant does not work, the master can throw him out. Now, if this relationship can be understood not so much as master and servant, but as people who are doing one kind of job as against people who are doing another kind of job together to produce whatever needs to be produced so that jointly they prosper, that is when that relationship begins to change. Now, how do you go about doing this is really an aspect of confrontation where, and this is where the HR body begins to come into its own, is where information is brought to bear for the master to say, this will not get you what you want. And for the servant to say, and for the servant to be told that this will not get you what you want. And therefore, what we need to do is to understand that this is what is required, and for the master to understand this is what is required, and for them both to give up this master-servant thinking process to become colleagues in an organization with different roles to perform. That, in fact, is an extremely useful and important role which HR can play. And this is where it begins to become much more useful as an assistant to the organization. So therefore, this is the process that one goes through. Is over a period of time to begin to push back to both these people that this is the role, this is what is expected of us in this role, and there is no master, there is no servant. We are together in this whole thing, and our job is to get together and work together. Now, if the master is overbearing, let's tell him that he is overbearing. If the servant is not performing, let's tell the servant that he needs to perform. And the way to tell the servant and the way to tell the master, there are ways to do this, and the HR body is an expert at this. And that is how HR begins to become useful. Is that making sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you. We have one more audience question.
Can I add one sentence here?
Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Yeah, I would just like to advise the questioner to take a look at Edgar Sheen's book called The Humble Inquiry. Edgar Sheen says that master's success is heavily dependent on the servant becoming successful. That is, he doesn't use the master-servant words, he says boss and subordinate. So if the subordinate becoming successful is important for the boss to be successful, I think the logic is obvious. And the entire book is written around this theme. Okay.
Yeah, I've read
useful, actually.
I think that what you brought out is very beautiful, which is that is exactly what needs to be done. How to do it is the question, and how to make this happen in an organization where sometimes the master feels even the HR person is a servant. So it's a complicated situation where one has to work at it carefully, but we have the knowledge and we have to do it. That is our job.
We have a question from Rishabh from TISS. He's asked for all the panelists to predict the top 10 priorities of the Chief People's Officer in the coming decade. I'm not sure we have time for top 10. Could we try top 5?
Wow.
Can you repeat the question? Top 10 what?
He'd like to understand top 10, or I'm saying top 5 priorities for the Chief People's Officer, which is the HR head of the people in the HR space for the coming decade.
Okay. Yeah. Can I start it?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
I will just start what comes to my mind. I think the priority remains culture. Priority remains culture, and it's likely to remain for a fairly long time. And I would go ahead and say that as far as Indian managers are concerned, it is about Indian culture. And one of the things which I would rather emphasize is that the education is in English. People read English books, they read American books, they're reading European books, but they don't read Indian books that actually tells us what the Indian culture is and how our own people, how the downtrodden actually think and live. And losing contact with them is what our education system has achieved. But we work in the very same culture. So, if you want to understand culture, we again have to rediscover the roots. So that becomes the second aspect. We must focus on culture. We must rediscover our roots. I think these are two from my side.
I would add to this also with one more priority, which I think is becoming more and more necessary in my mind, is this whole issue of leadership. What is leadership? what is the role of leadership, what is the role as is required today, and therefore how do we go about becoming leaders in order to take the organizations or the country to wherever we want to be. That includes culture, which is what Vivek is brought about, and that includes the understanding of the culture at the grassroots, as well as the culture that is imbibed through government education and through Western influence and so on and so forth. So therefore, there is need to look at leadership and its ability to integrate the influences that are working on the human being in India today, and being able to put them together in order to succeed in this world at large. That's my thought.
Yeah, so I'd like to add here.
Yes.
I think treating people as individuals and understanding the context, their experience, exposure, and their educational background and the cultural background they come from is very important, because we are working in a multicultural, multinational kind of an environment, most of us, because most of the organizations are global organizations. So contextualizing the person's experience, the employee's experience, and so I think that is very crucial.
I also feel that reaching out to people is very important, and corporations are becoming huge, and the chief executive doesn't know people, unlike small organizations which existed maybe 50 years back. So if we want to create a great organization, which is the final goal of any HR guy, I think how to bridge the gap and how to know the pulse of the frontline soldier. Okay, and we need to create tools for understanding that.
I would add to that. In the earlier conversation, when Vivek said about going into oneself, and Pallav said about purpose, and Aroon said about people. And today what I hear a lot is we have to more and more technology has to be done, and the humans are forgotten. So first thing, priority is to be human oneself. Can I connect with myself? Take an inner search into myself, and to the degree to which I am ready to go, that is where I can go and work with people. So I would say the priority is to understand oneself. Go back to the saying Tattvamasi.
Okay, I think all the points are covered, but I would be very explicit in terms of reiterating the point. In the future of organization as it develops in India, especially in this changing environment, I would think the biggest task would be to build a culture which has primarily emphasis on 3 values. First is trust. Second is reciprocity and collaboration. And third is innovation. Now, to me, it means, for example, creativity, very simply, to me, is an individual phenomenon. And when in an organization you create mechanisms, an institutional phenomena like innovation comes out. Innovative organizations where creative people innovate things to build product, awesome services, and so on. So I think the biggest challenge would be to build this culture, and that culture building through could be different. It could be a subset of leadership development. It could be creating the processes and systems aligning to build those values. It could be in terms of helping the organization to see what's there in the future, and therefore, can we build those values strongly inside the organization to remain competitive?
Well, that is beautifully put. It actually summarizes my webinar for me. Thank you so much, Pallav. We've reached the last couple of minutes of this session. And I'd like to thank all our panelists for this wisdom today. It is essential to enable us to be better professionals at what we do. But more importantly, I think we leave here as better people, striving harder to do more than what we started. I'd like to thank you for making the time and for being so active on this panel. I'd like to thank the NHRDN for making this possible. Avinash, who's been our administrator on this and has been supporting us with the tech, and Gangapriya from Chennai, who's been able to do this. Thank you, Joseph George, for writing this book, without which so many of us wouldn't have the gift of access to these 6 amazing human beings in their lives. And thank you, participants, for being on this webinar. I hope you've come in with all your questions, and we will take more questions on email if you should. So please send them in. We'll have the panel answer them through the NHRDN. I hope you leave here richer than when you came into this webinar. And with that, I'd like to call this webinar to a close. I wish you all a very good evening, a great life, and may your work be played. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Pearl. There's just one person in the background without whose prompt we may not have come here, and that's Mr. Sudesh Venkatesh of the Azim Premji Foundation. I think he has a role for Southern Region HR as far as NHRDN is concerned. He got in conversation with Gangapriya, and that's how Gangapriya got in touch with us. So I would like to acknowledge his nudge, if that were the current word to be used. So I didn't want it to go unreported. Thank you, Sudesh.
Thank you, Sudesh, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank
you very much.
Pearl.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys. Nice to have met you. Meet again.
Thank you. Nice meeting you, Paul.
See you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sure, well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.